Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Slugs and Steins, lectures from UC Santa Cruz. I'm Mike Riepe, and with me is also David Hansen. We're co-founders of Slugs and Steins and former members of the UCSC Alumni Council. For those of you who are new, Slugs and Steins engages a UCSC faculty member in discussion with all of you, our alumni, friends, and family. We wanted to feel just like you're back at UC Santa Cruz, sitting in class, but with a drink in your hand and without an exam. It's hard to believe, but tonight this series goes into its 8th year of bringing you thoughtful and engaging talks by some of our favorite professors. Before we get started, and since we can't see you, we'd like to know where you'll be joining us from this evening. And how many people are watching with you. Please take a moment to fill out the short poll that just popped up on your screen. We'll share the results after we've given everyone a few moments to respond. Just 2 small questions. Okay. Thanks to those who responded. You should be able to see the results on the screen and who's in this virtual room with you today. Looks like about 3/4 of us, just one person, but we've got some couples. Most people, as usual, coming from Santa Cruz County in the Bay Area. But let's see, we've got 7 people from outside the Bay Area, 6 people from other areas of the United States. Maybe that includes my parents. Hi, Gloria and Dave. 1 person from outside the US, nobody from outer space. So you can dismiss that when you're done. All right, tonight we'll be tipping our steins with Dr. Alexa Fredston, assistant professor in the Department of Ocean Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She earned a PhD in environmental science and management at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University with a BA in ecology and evolutionary biology and a certificate in environmental studies. Fredston's postdoctoral research was at Rutgers University, and she also previously worked for the Environmental Defense Fund. We will pose questions for Dr. Fredston at a few breakpoints during the lecture, as well as at the end. So you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. As soon as they occur to you, just throw them in there. If you see someone else's questions that you like, you can look in the Q&A box, and please upvote those. We'll do our best to make sure that those questions are answered sooner. All right, does everyone have their steins? Wonderful. I've got your slug, Dr. Alexa Fredston. Oh, we can't hear you, Alexa. You're on mute. Everyone does that.
You know, I spend hours a day on Zoom, and I still do it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm stoked to be here and to be bringing you into my classroom for the next hour to talk to you a little bit about species on the move, my research, and generally, hopefully answering all of your questions about this phenomenon. So we'll dive right in, and there'll be lots of chances for you to weigh in as we go. The context of species on the move is, of course, that our planet is warming. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this talk about the science of our changing climate, although I'm happy to answer questions about it. But I will say that you've experienced this here in California, and all of the life around you has too. Everything in nature has seen these incredibly warm years that, as you can see from this map, cover our land and sea. This is, of course, for 2024, but this wasn't an anomalous year in terms of recent heating. Here's a graph that's a few years older from 2020, showing that the last time that we had a cool year or cooler than average year was in the 1970s. And since then, all of our years have been above average and recently much, much warmer. So what does this mean for the planet, for biodiversity? That's what we're going to talk about today. Every single ecosystem on Earth has been experiencing some form of climatic variability, and almost all of them have experienced change in the past few years. This manifests in all sorts of phenomena, from species turning their leaves red earlier in the fall, or sorry, later in the fall, budding earlier in spring, and changes in every ecosystem and species that you can imagine. So when things in nature experience these changes, they have sort of three choices that we often think about. They can adapt to these changes. They can move away from this climate that's no longer very pleasant for them. And if they don't do either one of those things, they might die. So I'm not going to talk about adaptation very much in this talk, although if you have questions about it, you can certainly let me know. One way that animals are adapting to warming temperatures is actually by shrinking. The bigger you are, the more your metabolic demand is intense and spikes when it's really hot out. And so it's become more beneficial for animals in particular to be sort of small and nimble when it's really hot. So we do see animals actually evolving to be smaller in warmer environments, but we're mostly going to talk about the other option, which is them moving. Not just animals, all species are on the move. And that's what you came here to hear about. But of course, if they don't do either one of these things in response to climate change, especially once that climate change sort of exceeds their ability to cope with the environment, they may, at least in a certain area, go extinct. So what do I mean by species on the move? I actually kind of mean two things. One of them is species moving in space. These are two of my favorite examples, and you've maybe heard of the first one. This is a grizzly bear, also known as the polar grizzly cross. And these bears occurred because grizzly bears have gone further and further than ever before in North America as it's gotten warmer in Canada. They have spread further north and actually mated with polar bears, producing the light brown, kind of coffee-colored grizzly bear. So that's an example of a species on the move, is grizzly bears moving up through North America. And another one is mackerel in the North Sea, which has triggered what is often called the fish wars. We'll circle back to the fish wars later because they're fascinating. But essentially, this species, which was historically not caught incredibly far north, had an agreement between a number of countries that were catching it, and then it shifted into Iceland's waters. And Iceland promptly decided it was their fish and started catching as much as they could, setting off this actually quite major geopolitical event around mackerel. So this is one kind of species in the move. They're moving through space, but they can also move through time. And it isn't always that obvious that you can think about this as movement, but a lot of species have changed their seasonal patterns in response to climate change. These are a couple super interesting examples. One really common way this shows up is migratory birds. They live in one habitat in the summer, totally different habitat in the winter, and they often evolved to make that transition so that during one or both of those seasons, they're able to find food. But if it's hotter than usual when they arrive in summer, for example, or in winter, it can cause them to either have a lot of stress as they're traveling because they're like literally really hot, or to not encounter the food that they count on when they arrive. So in this example, this is a bird that migrates to Siberia, supposedly timed with a peak of insects that it can eat, but by the time it arrives, those insects have already peaked and vanished because it's gotten warmer in Siberia, and they are declining as a result. So that pattern is sort of moving through time. And similarly, a lot of flowers and trees are both budding and leafing out earlier in the spring, and then either having sort of the beautiful fall foliage that we often look for, and then losing their leaves much later in the fall. My favorite example of species moving through time is from Japan. This is, I think, the longest sort of consistent, what we call a time series. So a consistent record through time of a species responding to environmental change. These are cherry blossoms in Kyoto. We, for a long time, have known when there is a peak in cherry blossoms in Kyoto because it is a huge tourist event and a huge event for people living there. But that's been true for thousands of years. And researchers have reconstructed from historical documents, from personal diaries of wealthy people in Kyoto, on what day in the Japanese lunar calendar was the peak of the cherry blossoms. And on that day, obviously, there were a lot of events and festivals. And this graph is actually showing you what day of the year that was on this y-axis. And the thing on the x-axis is the year. So we have a sense of how early in the season these trees flowered, starting as early as 800 AD. And when I look at this, what I notice is that there's sort of this long-term pattern where there's sort of flowering around the 100th day of the year, maybe 105th day of the year. But then starting in the mid, like 1850 or so, you see this trend where they're flowering earlier and earlier. And this is another example of a species sort of moving through time. So I want to pause here and do a small experiment with you, which is to ask you to tell me if you've ever noticed something like this where you live. We're going to switch to a website called Mentimeter, which is going to create a little word cloud of your answers. So try to keep them relatively short. And you can either scan this QR code and answer on your phone, or you can just go to this website and enter the code. And either way, what I'm hoping you'll tell us is where you are, and if you've ever noticed something out of place in space, something you haven't seen before, a new species, or something happening at a strange time of year. So I'm going to click over now and see if I can start to see your results. Bear with me because we couldn't totally test this in advance, and I'm looking at my other monitor over here on the left. Let's see. I'm going to try this. Okay, awesome. I can see your responses. Can you see them? I'm assuming yes, unless someone interrupts me. So these are great answers. Someone mentioned that maybe you're in Alaska or spent time in Alaska and you've seen ice melting early. Ice cover in Alaska is one of the most rapidly changing climate signals that we have, and also actually an incredibly rapidly changing ecosystem, because the ice governs so much about nature in Alaska. It actually governs the temperature at the bottom of the ocean, in the Gulf of Alaska and the Eastern Bering Sea and lots of other places. So a number of people mentioned, or at least one person mentioned, fire, which is also something that we have seen expand seasonally, right? We used to have much more of a fire season in California. Now we kind of have a fire year. Poison oak is a great example. Poison oak did not used to be as abundant and has had a fairly large expansion in both its distribution and its abundance for a bunch of reasons. So that is a great example of a species on the move. Poppies blossoming in January, I have never seen. That's wild. I'm assuming you're in California. And that's really surprising. And we have some sad ones about losing Western turtles and cypress. And obviously, when species are on the move, some places gain them, right? A new species might appear. Sometimes that's exciting and beneficial, but you also have other places losing species that they care about. So we're going to go back. There will be lots more chances to ask questions and tell me more about what you've seen. So if you didn't get yours in, don't worry. We're going to talk a little bit about species on the move, what that means, what it means for not just single species, but species interacting with each other, whole ecosystems. I'll talk a little bit about whether we can predict species in the move and how to do that, which is an intersection with my own research. And then we'll kind of end with a bunch of stuff about fisheries, which is one of my personal favorite things to talk about. So I'm going to walk you through some of the early studies that we have about species on the move, and then we'll kind of catch you up to speed on where scientists like me are now. So in 1999, this is sort of the earliest paper on this question, was published saying that in 35 resident, so non-migratory European butterfly species, 2/3 of them shifted north during that century. Butterflies are one of these things that people love to go out and look at. So we have great historical data on butterflies, not as long as the cherry blossoms, but still really helpful. A few years later, actually the same person did a giant project looking across almost 700 studies in scientific literature and found now, instead of looking at species shifting in space, we're looking at them shifting in time. And again, about 2/3 of those had this pattern of spring advancement where frog breeding, bird nesting, flowering, tree bud bursts, and the arrival of migrants were all shifting earlier in the calendar year. And lastly, also quite early on in the development of this field, we realized that that means when things start moving in space and time, their interactions with one another can get disrupted. So I told you about that a little bit with the bird migrating, but not coinciding anymore with when the insect it likes to eat is abundant. This is a really similar example where you have this moth species that evolved to hatch from eggs into caterpillars just as the trees were starting to kind of produce little buds that those caterpillars like to eat. But the trees have started doing that in the Netherlands, where the study happened, weeks earlier because it's warmer. And as a result, the caterpillars hatch and have no food, and they don't do very well. So this is a great example of when any single species starts to change in response to the environment, there are always domino effects throughout ecosystems. So this is kind of what that looks like in time. And if we think about it in space, this is from a great study that showed that a lot of marine species in the North Sea, that's what we're looking at, have shifted north, but at different rates. So on the left, you have a cod. This is sort of shifted at a slow rate. On the right, this is a very kind of fast-lived species called a blenny that shifted at quite a fast rate. In the middle is a deep sea species called an anglerfish, and that guy didn't shift at all. So what this means is if you were at any sort of different part of this ocean, you might end up with a different set of species now than you had 20 years ago. Maybe you gained the blenny species, maybe you lost the cod species, but the ones that are present are kind of turning over and reshuffling, and this is happening all over the world, not just in these examples that I'm showing you. So for at least 20 years, we've known that species are shifting their ranges towards the poles. In the southern hemisphere, they're going south. Northern hemisphere, they're going north. Their seasonal timing, which is called phenology, is moving earlier in spring, later in fall. And that's changing the overlap of species in space and time, often with kind of bad consequences for ecosystems. But a lot of science has happened since then. So this is not to say that we knew everything at that point. So I'm going to catch you up a little bit on where we're at. One of the main areas of research in the past few years has been what species in the move mean for us, for nature, but also for people. And we've realized that species in the move have enormous consequences, not only for the health of ecosystems when they start to affect really important species, but also on the climate itself. Species in the move affect our resilience to fire, the amount of carbon stored in our soils, and directly on human health. So many of you might remember before the COVID pandemic, there was Zika, which was an enormous focus in the news media in around 2016. This was actually a species on the move. This was a virus that had a much smaller geographical distribution and is carried by mosquitoes. That's the disease vector. Mosquitoes are becoming more and more abundant throughout the Americas because of climate change. And that disease made the jump to the Americas and then was able to spread its distribution largely because those were incredibly warm years. It's not just diseases, it's also pests. So this gets back at this comment I just made about species in the move affecting how the planet stores carbon. This is a map from 2008 of mountain pine bark beetles. They're now much more widespread than they were in this map. But these beetles are pests that destroy trees. Once they really kind of eat their way through a tree, usually the tree dies and then it becomes incredibly flammable. So they've been tied to huge fires in the Mountain West. And we recently realized that's because the season in which they can live is now so long in most of Western North America that they actually have 2 life cycles instead of 1. So they're sort of twice as damaging. And a lot of these outbreaks are not just a linear relationship with temperature. Many of these insects are controlled by how cold it gets in winter or at night. Sometimes it's a freezing threshold, sometimes it's a little bit below freezing, but there are usually thresholds like that beyond which they just can't live. And so as the winters get warmer, the entire sort of North American continent has really opened up to these pests. Another big focus of recent research has been understanding what species in the move, when species in the move endanger things and make it possible for them to actually go extinct. And one example of that is species in the move up mountains. We call this poetically, but kind of tragically, the escalator to extinction. So as mountain ranges get warmer, where do you go, right? If you're in a mountain, it gets really hot. And so you're trying to find cooler climates, you go up. And that works for everyone until you get to the top of the mountain. And we have seen a lot of extinctions, local extinctions, not yet extinct from the whole planet, but extinct from mountain ranges, particularly the really high elevation species, because they have nowhere to go. They're trapped. There are also traps that happen kind of on the landscape scale. And that's when, when you're responding to climate change, obviously these species aren't going to like pull out their phone and look at a model and say, gee, it would be really advantageous for me to move from the Gulf Coast to the southeastern United States. They're responding in a very local, small scale way. And sometimes, so they're like a bird on a mountain range that says, well, the cooler climate is up slope of me. They're going to go nearby where it's cooler. And sometimes that leads all of them into the same place, and then there's no climatic path out. So this is an example of how that looks on the Australian continent, where these places that are stars are places where any species in a neighboring patch that was trying to escape global warming might go into those little locally cooler places. But as those get hotter, they are trapped and they can't shift anywhere else. And the last sort of piece of what's happened with species on the move up to now, I'll tell you about, is the changes to whole ecosystems, right? We talked a little bit about species interactions changing, but I also mentioned that we've had this phenomenon where species are kind of reshuffling all around the globe. Some of them are moving north faster than others. That means in any one place, you might have a different set than you did a few decades ago. And in some places, especially sort of temperate zones like here, there's been an enormous increase in species from the tropics. This is actually called tropicalization, and it has happened most prominently in the oceans, where places that used to be kind of temperate reefs and have kelp now have corals growing there, or tropical seagrasses and different fish than they used to before. So the entire ecosystem has sort of rolled into a warmer affiliated state where it looks a lot more like the tropics than it used to. I know that was a lot of information. That's my very quick recap of sort of what species of the move means as a field of study and also for our planet. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much. So we have another dimension here that Van asks about, and that's the age of animals. You mentioned the beetle, perhaps getting older, but is younger also a direction? What is the impact on the age of species of climate
So
change?
that's a phenomenal question. So we think that climate change makes it more advantageous to just have a live fast, die young mentality. You grow quickly, but you don't get that big. You accomplish your whole life cycle, and then you do have a shorter lifespan. And that's partly just because typically as things, especially animals, but also plants, think about trees, as they get older, they get bigger. And in a warmer world, it's really hard to get very big. If you look at the fossil record, many of the eras when we had huge animals were relatively cold. And so it is not that beneficial to have things get very large and live to be very old. But it's also worth pointing out that other human impacts on the planet have gotten rid of most of our old things. We don't have that many big old trees. We don't have that many big old animals left. And that's not because of climate change. That's just because of other human effects on nature.
Great, thank you. And thanks for all the questions, Van. We have also a question from Jan. How is the changing climate affecting birth rates and trends among wildlife?
That's a phenomenal question. So the answer to that question is sort of all over the map because like I said earlier, some animals are adapting to climate change and also plants by just producing a lot of offspring. That's their strategy, just produce a ton of offspring. Some of them will grow old enough to reproduce and then they survive to the next generation. So that's their strategy. But also when organisms, especially animals, experience metabolic stress, they often don't reproduce as much because they're putting all of their energy reserves into staying alive, basically. So especially for large animals like mammals, when they're experiencing physical stress because of the climate, they're not going to produce offspring or produce as many. And that's something we look for when we manage, natural populations is if we start to see the number of offspring per individual decline, we get very worried for this reason.
I'm gonna ask a question from the moderator, and I'm sorry, this is last week I picked up a piece of coral on the beach down here in Aptos. And I thought, wow, that's weird. Now, it could have been a tourist who just dropped it out of his or her pocket, but are we seeing that now, even in the Monterey Bay?
Oh, amazing question. I don't think we have tropical reef building corals establishing themselves in Monterey Bay or in California. We have always had non-reef building corals in this part of the ocean, so they don't look like the Great Barrier Reef. They're not the famous ones, but they are, little things that look like rocks in the oceans. They're alive. Corals are actually animals, and they're part of that family. So, and some of them live very deep in sort of places with just a glimmer of light trickling down. So we have other temperate coral species. That might have been what you saw, or it might have been a tourist. I'm not sure. All right, I'll keep. Oh, are there any more questions?
We have one more from Van, but maybe that's a good leading question. Points
Great.
out that people can live longer with medical breakthroughs. What can we do for animals or animals that are dying younger? So maybe that's a good lead into what you're talking about next. So
Thank you, and that's a great lead in.
we will go
One of,
move forward now.
so one of the fascinating, kind of intersections between human medicine and our understanding of human impacts on the planet has been the that we have seen an enormous emergence of disease in the oceans, and we especially see disease when it's really hot, which is not something we expected. If you go back and look at reports written in the 1990s and 2000s about what they thought climate change would look like, they're very accurate, but they did not anticipate that when we had significant warming, we would also have huge disease outbreaks, including in the oceans. And there are a huge number of sort of possible ways to address this, but we don't really know how you kind of large scale administer medicine to wild populations. On the West Coast, you might be familiar with the loss of a very beautiful sea star called the sunflower sea star, which experienced a disease sort of before and then during the huge heat wave that we had from 2014 to 2016. So it's, intervening to protect those species is challenging, but it is something we've talked about, especially for species that have major conservation concerns. So there are bat species that are at high risk of certain diseases where we actually have tried to intervene and prevent the disease from spreading between bat caves, for example. So that's probably the most obvious way that humans try to prevent them from dying young. But that actually, so that really is a great segue, because I told you that was something that we didn't see coming in the context of climate change and biodiversity. And that's what we're going to start talking about is could we see any of this coming? This is an animation of where mammals, birds, and amphibians in North America might go if they perfectly tracked their climatic conditions. So that's a little bit like we were discussing earlier with the mountaintop example. If you're a frog and your perfect climate is an average annual temperature of 62 degrees Fahrenheit, that average annual temperature is not in the same place in the United States as it was in 1980. So you would have to move probably to the north to stay in those climatic conditions. And that's what this map is showing you. But we don't actually know the degree which animals are doing this. We know they're moving north, but can we actually tell you next year where they're going to be? That's a lot harder. That's actually really what I work on. I just submitted a huge NSF grant, which probably won't get funded in the current climate, to try to answer this question for humpback whales migrating off of California. Okay, so this is my next question. It says Zoom question, but it should be Mentimeter question. So it's the same instructions as before with the link and the QR code that I sent you, to tell me, what do you, like, if you wanted to know how humpback whales were going to respond to climate change in their seasonal timing, in their distribution. Let's say I'm giving you all the information about temperature change that you could want, but what else would you need to know to actually guess when it's this hot in 2030, where are the whales going to go? So that's your next quiz question, which is over here. And I don't know if someone still has the link for the poll and can put it in the chat. Otherwise, I can go back to that slide.
And when I refresh the poll, I'm still getting the first question.
Ooh, let me be sure that it started this question.
Yeah, I'm having trouble finding the code also. I didn't write
Mm.
it down.
So I'll put the code in the chat. And if I can find the chat now,
The code is at the top there, menti.com.
yeah, okay, great. So you can see that. Perfect. But I don't know why it's not working if you were able to, I don't want to reset results. You're able to do the other one. Hang on. That one worked fine. I'm gonna refresh this. Well, we won't spend too much time on it, so we can also just move on and you can tell me your thoughts later. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So we have two answers. There are both great answers already. So the first one is food availability. This is in some ways probably the most important thing that you could have said, because when you think about a humpback whale, right, it lives all over the oceans. It goes from the Arctic Circle to the tropics. So probably it doesn't care that much if the global oceans get 1 degree warmer or 2 degrees warmer, but it cares a lot about its food. And its food might care whether it got 1 or 2 degrees warmer, because now we're talking about, little fish that are really closely tied to environmental changes. So that's a huge part, we think, of how to predict what's happening with whales and other big animals, is to understand what's happening with their food. Competition is also something that we really try to take into account when we think about species on the move, because, like I said, no species is interacting with climate change in isolation. And actually, climate change can upend the competitive balance between species in ways that I'm happy to talk about if anyone's curious. What else do we have? You need to know not only the temperature, but also sort of the temperature that their prey like, which is a great point. The humpback whales eat a lot of different species in California. They eat anchovy, they eat sardines, they eat krill. And so ideally, we need to know all of those things. And of course, we need to know something about the future climate. So like what's going to happen to ocean temperature in the future. So what we proposed doing in this project that we just outlined was trying to address these questions by pulling together data from many different scales. And the goal here, right, is we talked about understanding what's happening to ocean temperature, but also the prey. And the other thing about whales, which we didn't really mention on the last slide, but was a big part of this project, is the fact that they're social animals. They're mammals. They're like us. They have memory. They have families. They have preferences and personalities. And those actually, we think, play a huge role in things like how long am I going to eat in Monterey Bay before I keep migrating? Or when do I want to head south for the winter? So what we've proposed doing is integrating data from tags put on individual whales, which can give us that sense of their personality and their memory. So are they coming to Monterey Bay because they actually remember it, or because they just decided in that year it had good food? And then we're going to pull in other data streams like expert photos to give us this bigger picture that all of you alluded to on the previous slide about how over all of California, the distribution of whales is related to the distribution of their prey and to the ocean environment. So these actually are, I think this is sort of where our field has gone, is trying to do much more sophisticated models. So this is a hierarchical Bayesian model, which I will talk your ear off about if anyone asks. I'm guessing no one will. That's aimed at doing a much better job of predicting what whales are actually going to do by using all of these different pieces of information, not just temperature. But in general, predicting species in the move is challenging. So the thing I just outlined for you is a giant multi-year project, and it may only get so far. We probably won't be able to perfectly predict what whales are doing. So I'm going to break this question down a little bit more and give you a couple examples of research that is moving our field's understanding of species in the move forward. Some of this is research that I did a few years ago to answer the question for ocean fish. To what degree can we explain what they're doing with just temperature? If only temperature explained how they move through the oceans from year to year, that would be great. We could say, okay, as soon as it gets warmer, we know exactly where they're going to go. We can predict their movements. We're done. And I did this using long-term data collected by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. NOAA actually goes out in the oceans all around the United States and goes fishing every year and publishes those data. They've been doing that for a very long time. It's incredibly helpful for the kind of research I do. So let me show you the results. We're going to ask two things. First of all, did the fish shift north in these three regions of the United States? So we're looking at the Eastern Bering Sea in Alaska, the West Coast, that's our survey that includes California, and the Northeast US, New England. So in each of those regions, we'll ask, did they shift toward the poles or away from the poles or neither? So if they shifted toward the poles, it's on this side of the plot. And did they end up in warmer or cooler water? Now, if the species tracked temperature, so if it's exactly following a specific climate from year to year, it will be on this horizontal zero line, because regardless of whether it went poleward or equatorward, it will have stayed in the exact same temperature it wanted to be in. Here's how the data actually look from, I think, 165 species of fish. And there are three take-home messages from this project. The first is actually that most of them do at least overlap with this horizontal zero line, which suggests that their range edges didn't actually end up someplace much colder or much warmer than where they started. So they actually did seem like they're tracking temperature. You might notice that these points are kind of sloped diagonally, and all that that's telling us is that the species that moved super far towards the poles actually ended up in colder oceans, so they really ran north. And the species that moved toward the south ended up someplace hotter. So those species kind of went into the face of climate change. We don't totally understand why. The main hypothesis we have for that is that it had to do with food availability, but that's an open research area. And that happens in other systems, not just marine fish, where you see these weird examples of species shifting in the wrong direction. But the most troubling result from this is that the biggest outliers, the ones that really don't look like they're tracking climate change, are from the region that has had the most climate change, which is the Northeast US. I won't dive into the specifics of how much temperature has changed in each of these places, although if you have questions, I'm happy to. But the Northeast US is a global warming hotspot. It's warmed incredibly fast. So the fact that that place we don't see a really close coupling between exactly what happens with temperature and exactly what happens with fish probably means in the future, as the oceans get warmer everywhere, we can't predict fish distributions based on temperature alone. So that's sort of the first take home from this part. And then I also wanted to tell you about some of my California-based research on the intertidal. I'm hoping that many people here have been tide pooling in their lives. It's just one of the coolest experiences to go down to the coast right near where we live and see these incredible, bizarre animals living out their entire lives in these little tide pools. So these are animals, mussels, anemones are all animals, but they don't move. The only time they can change their geographical distribution is once per life cycle when they produce eggs. Those eggs get floated around by the water. That's how they move around. And then once they reach a certain age, they'll kind of settle down to the sand or seafloor, wherever they are. And if it's shallow enough and if it's a good enough habitat, they'll hatch and grow. And if it's not, they just kind of die. So these are a great case for studying species in the move because they can only move once per generation. Fish can swim around all the time, but not intertidal critters. So I have some research on these species using a very long-term monitoring program that's headquartered at UC Santa Cruz called the Multi-Agency Rocky Intertidal Network. They've been monitoring the Rocky Intertidal in California and the whole West Coast for decades. And so my phenomenal graduate student, Jordana, is trying to understand why those rocky intertidal species are found where they are in California and not other places. So what drives their distributions? And her hypothesis is that a lot of it has to do with where the ocean currents take these eggs. Because if they are only able to migrate when ocean currents carry their eggs somewhere, then you would expect that which ones you find at a particular place is really related to the patterns of coastal currents. So this has been a really fun project. It's very UCSC based. We have an undergrad in the lab right now who's a marine bio major, Bella, and a number of other UCSC faculty involved. I'll show you some of her preliminary results, which are essentially that we do find this pattern she expected, that when you have places that are more connected by ocean currents, regardless of how far apart they are in distance on the coast. But if you have a current going between the two sites, they're much more ecologically similar. They have way more of the same animals, which strongly suggests that we actually can maybe predict what intertidal species can migrate using these patterns of coastal connectivity in the ocean. And what that makes me think, and maybe some of you as well, is that it can help us conserve these species in the future. Because they can't move themselves except as larvae or eggs, they're very vulnerable to climate change. And if California's oceans get warmer, which may start happening around the middle of the century, these species can only migrate if the currents happen to line up to take them to a good habitat at the right time of year when they release those eggs. And that's not going to be true for all of them. So I've written a number of grant applications with the Nature Conservancy, trying to recruit someone to build models to sort of look at this intersection and find out which species are going to be trapped, unable to migrate based on what happens with the currents in the season when they spawn, and might need to be relocated by a conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy. Okay, so in addition to just thinking about whether species should be shifting or what we expect them to do based on temperature, we also really need to think about whether they can get there. And I'm not going to tell you more about my research now because I want to talk a little bit about fisheries, but I'll just say that in my group, we have a lot more projects in this vein going on, thinking about the role of oxygen, of whether populations are increasing or decreasing, the presence of other prey or presence of predators and prey, the role of fishing, of time lengths, all these other kind of potential interacting processes to do a better job of predicting species on the move. So I'll do another pause for questions, and then we'll talk about fisheries for a few minutes before we have a kind of general discussion.
Adaptation. Are there any, Susan asked, are there any examples of animals adapting artificially or maybe quickly, like humans? She said, I'm not sure that we adapt all that well, but.
There are tons of examples of adaptation to climate change, and this is actually something that's really reassuring for us. So there's a fascinating example from California of a butterfly that specialized to a very specific plant. So the butterfly only pollinated that plant. The plant was only pollinated by the butterfly. They had sort of a very close relationship. But the plant started to decline. This was in Southern California. It didn't do well as Southern California has gotten really hot, as many of you know, in the past few decades. It was affected by housing development. So the plant was declining rapidly, and everyone thought this butterfly was going to go extinct because it only depended on this plant. And kind of at the 11th hour, it managed from one generation to the next to adapt to a different plant and recovered, actually without much human intervention. That's unusual. We call it an evolutionary rescue. And, you know, we don't want to put ourselves or put biodiversity in a position where we're just keeping our fingers crossed that evolution will do its work. But it does happen. And sometimes climate change kind of wipes out all the individuals that are less adapted to warmer environments. And then what's left is kind of a more resilient population. And that happens in some coral reefs. So one thing that you see in some reefs is you maybe know when it gets really hot, corals bleach, so they turn white, and then if that state persists for long enough, they'll die. But if a reef has experienced bleaching in the past, the ones that survived it are sometimes more resilient to the next bleaching event. And we think that's what's happening. They sort of are evolving to get a little bit more heat tolerant. They probably won't evolve that way forever. So we think there's kind of a hard stop to how far they can go. But yes, that kind of adaptation is happening all around us.
Yeah, interesting question. So that's another way they can adapt is by changing behaviors. I think the question was if they have any adaptations that are artificial, like humans.
Oh,
I'm not, very few animals are capable of using tools or things, right? But
I misunderstood, but some of them are changing their behavior, which, yeah, it's not human. But for example, some amphibians like salamanders and things that are cold-blooded, so they're really sensitive to the air temperature, that used to hang out in the middle of the day, now kind of hide in the middle of the day and come out at dawn and dusk. So you do have behavioral changes. I haven't heard of any kind of Artificial change, but I'm sure I'll think of one as soon as we.
Learn how to build a roof, or
Yeah, why not?
or a fan, right? Thank you. Question from Jan. Was a warming ocean found to be the culprit in the huge loss of the crab population in the Bering Sea?
Yes. This is one of my favorite stories ever, and I'm so glad I get to tell it because I would almost put that in this talk, and then I thought no one's going to care about the snow crab. So you do. Okay. Alaska has an enormous crab fishery. If you've ever saw the show The Deadliest Catch, that's about the Alaskan crab fishery for snow crab, king crab, and a few others. And there was an enormous ocean heat wave in this part of the world from 2014 to 2016. It didn't sit anywhere for that entire time. It was literally a warm blob of water that was kind of oozing around the coast. So sometimes it was in California, sometimes it was in Alaska. And the other thing that happened, well, okay, so I'll leave it at that. And then several years after, there in a year that there happened to be a pandemic, the fishermen went out and went fishing and caught 0 crab. Crab take a few years to grow. They take 5 or 6 years to get big enough that we catch them. And so the first thing people thought was, well, maybe the crab moved. Maybe this is a species on the move. The Eastern Bering Sea is adjacent to the Northern Bering Sea, which is monitored by Russia. We don't have their data on what species are there. So the first thought was, okay, maybe the crab migrated. But our best guess now, reconstructing the sort of enormous just like collapse of the population from one year to the next, is that there was a cohort of crabs that kind of came of age during that large marine heat wave. And it happened to be the biggest cohort almost ever. So it was this age group that was more crabs than had ever been seen in the Eastern Bering Sea. Eastern Bering Sea. And in that year, there was also historically little food. It was really hot. There wasn't very much plankton. A lot of other things were struggling. And so we think what happened is that cohort starved to death. Ironically, if it had been a smaller population of crab that was kind of aging through and then aging into the fishery, they probably would have been fine. But it was this weird coincidence. If there was a heat wave, there were more baby crabs than had ever been in the Eastern Bering Sea. And we think there was just a massive die-off that we didn't notice because it was only a few years later that they got big enough for us to see their absence in the fishery. And that was compounded by the fact that in 2020, we did not have any surveys anywhere in the oceans. None of the surveys ran because of COVID-19. So we couldn't have any early warning of like, wait a minute, there are no little crabs when we thought there should be. So that's the fascinating crab story. It is very much a climate change story.
Thank you.
Okay.
Would you like to go ahead or take another?
Let's see, what time is it? I'll take another and then we'll do the next part quickly.
Okay, it was predicted, this is from Susan. It was predicted that the Permian extinction may have been caused by high temperatures, thermally stabilizing the oceans. So there was no upwelling, and the oceans became oligotrophic and anaerobic at depth. This led to the H2S burst that poisoned the animals on the land. Con, do you please comment on this?
So one of our biggest sources of uncertainty about modern climate change is how it will affect our global ocean's currents. The currents in the global ocean, especially the ones that kind of go from the surface to the bottom and that control upwelling, change at very slow time scales. And this is not my area of research, but I have talked to my colleagues in ocean sciences about this, and their general consensus is that they're still optimistic that we won't see collapses in these major currents that would cause the kind of future that you're discussing, which is when they just sort of stop operating and we don't have an influx of nutrients from the deep ocean, which is what drives so much biological productivity in places like California. So it could happen, and it's worth exploring as kind of a worst case scenario. People are thinking about that and writing about it. The most likely models currently say that that's not in the cards for us, at least in the next century. but certainly the planet has surprised us before, and it's not exactly my area of research, so I can't comment on how likely it is. Let's dive into fisheries, and then we'll have a bit more time at the end to keep answering your questions. So I don't like giving doom and gloom talks, which is maybe surprising to you because of what I work on, but I really actually feel that there's an enormous amount that we can do to address these issues and to work hard to preserve the biodiversity that we have. And a lot of my work on that has been focused on US federal fisheries management. We're going to talk just for a few minutes about what that looks like in the context of species on the move. Just to give you a little lesson, these slides are literally pulled from my class. This is how fisheries are divvied up around the world. Countries on Earth through the United Nations signed on to an agreement saying that everyone has rights to their own resources, including fishing, also stuff like mining, from 3 to 200 nautical miles off the coast. That's called your exclusive economic zone, or your EEZ. It's the bubbles on this map. And these are the kind of species that you catch in closer or further than the exclusive economic zone. So from 0 to 3 nautical miles in the US, those waters are managed by the state. And those are your really near shore species. That includes anything in the intertidal, like abalone, anything that, or most of the things that use rivers, and also something super close to the coast. But most of our major fisheries in the United States operate in this EEZ, this exclusive economic zone, from 3 to 200 nautical miles. It's all of our kind of big unglamorous fish, the flounder, the cod, the hake, the pollock, the haddock, most of the stuff that we actually eat lives out there, as does the little fish, sardines, anchovies, mackerel. And then further out on the high seas are the kind of super expensive sushi fish. That's tuna, swordfish, mahi-mahi, things like that. These are things that in their biology almost kind of act like a shark. They're really large, they migrate. We're not going to talk that much about them unless you have questions about them. And I like talking about federal fisheries because this is where I got my start. Mike told you that I worked at the Environmental Defense Fund. And the way the US manages its federal fisheries is by delegating almost all responsibility for them to these 8 fishery management councils, which are regional bodies that are supposed to have all the expertise to appropriately and sustainably manage our ocean resources. And when I worked at the Environmental Defense Fund, I was assigned to the specific fishery management council, which includes California. And these people meet 5 times a year for 8 days straight, starting at 7 in the morning, because they're just that committed to sustainable fisheries management. And I was assigned to this one group called the Groundfish Management Team, and I sat in there for so long that they gave me a certificate for being their most valued member of the public, because no other members of the public were ever in there except me. So these bodies do a really good job of balancing different interests to try to sustainably manage our fisheries. But they're doing it in the context of a warming world. So this map is showing you not a projection for the future, but the temperature change that's already happened on our land and sea surface. And let's look at North America. You see this huge red blob off of New England. And actually off of California, you'll notice that it's like blue, and that area has not warmed that much. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how that looks in New England, and then we'll kind of skip ahead so that we can wrap up and take all your questions. But this part of the world has experienced huge warming in the oceans, and as a result, fish stocks are moving really far to the north. This has some weird effects, like the fishing industry is also moving to the north, but because of the way we permit fishing vessels, they have to land the fish, they have to bring it back to their port of origin. So you see fishing boats leaving and chasing these fish up the coast. This boat was probably catching the species I just showed you a time lapse of, which is sea bass or a related species. But boats that live in Beaufort used to fish right off of Beaufort in the 90s, and now they fish off of New Jersey. So they literally just drive all the way up to New Jersey, fish, and drive back because that's what they have to do because of fishing regulations. So just to give you a sense of what is happening with fisheries. So like I told you, these boats are shifting, they're very far away from their home ports. The way that we assess fisheries, so that means we figure out how many fish are in the sea and how much we should catch, tends to be these really large regional scales. And I'm part of a group that's trying to figure out whether we should start doing it at smaller scales so we can detect that some are doing better and some are doing worse in a warmer world. We may end up with different species doing well in our future oceans. So this is a graphic about cod in New England, which we think is going to do pretty poorly in the future. So the dominant species in fisheries may not be the same in the future as they were in the past. And finally, in places like the East Coast, where we have 3 of these councils that divide quota between them, we have a lot of states. And in places like where we have our mackerel wars, we may end up with a lot of fights over who gets to fish because the fish themselves are on the move. So I'm going to skip the last couple slides to just be sure that we have some time for questions. My graduate student is working on some of these fisheries related impacts in California in the context of El Nino. And let's just go to the wrap up and sort of ending slide. Although I'm happy to take your questions about fisheries, but you're welcome to circle back to some of these earlier themes. So to sort of remind you where we started, we talked about species on the move, the fact that they're shifting their distributions and their timing. We talked about what that means for species interactions and for ecosystems changing. We then moved on to whether we can predict these shifts and what that would take. And finally talked just for a moment about what this all means for fishing in the United States and for federal fisheries. So happy to take questions, and then I have a thank you slide at the end.
Thank you. We actually have a fish question here from
Great.
Sabra. You mentioned the fish were getting smaller to adapt to the rising ocean temperatures. Is it sexual selection? Do fish generally do that when they mate, or natural selection of a different kind?
A lot of things are getting smaller, including fish. And that is mostly, we think, natural selection. So the species that have a faster life history, they mature faster and produce offspring sooner, are being more successful in warmer and more changing oceans. But also fishing removes all of the big fish. So fish have gotten smaller in addition, even without the effects of climate change, because we tend to catch bigger fish.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Susan. Thanks, Susan. What fish are most likely to be no longer commercially viable because of changes you described? But maybe they'll still survive.
Well, Atlantic cod here in the United States, I think, is an iconic example of this. So I'll talk you through that example a little bit, although I wish it was a California example. California fisheries are not changing at the same rate that they are elsewhere, thankfully. But cod used to be the most dominant fishery in Eastern Canada and in New England for centuries. And with the rise of industrial fishing in the mid 20th century, and also kind of the increase in warming, the industrial fishing, what we think happened is industrial fishing very rapidly depleted the cod to a really low population size. And then cod also really like cold water. And so they just weren't able to bounce back. They had lost their position in the ecosystem. Other things like little sharks started to kind of move in and compete with them. And their habitat was just not as beneficial for their growth. It was too hot. They weren't able to reproduce and grow very well. And now the consensus is that they're kind of will not ever be a major fishery again for those species on this coast. They're fine in Europe, but in North America.
Interesting you say they're fun in Europe. I was reflecting, I spend much time in southern Norway in the summer times. And over my 50 plus years there, the temperature has risen by 3-4 degrees
Yeah.
Celsius, I'm thinking. And the quantity of cod I catch has diminished almost zero.
Really?
Lots of mackerel
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to before, and very little cod.
Hmm.
Okay, I want to ask a question. I don't see it up here anymore from Van, but he was asking about politics and or government policy. And so I might try and ask it for him. Which government policies that we have in this country, thinking backwards now, not in the future, made sense? We're going in the right direction. And if you were to pick a country elsewhere who has the better set of policies, sort of future-oriented policies? Which country would you pull out?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, so fisheries management in the United States is considered to be very strong. We have a great system of kind of checks and balances to when fish start to be depleted to back off of fishing, allow them to recover. We've rebuilt many of our overfished stocks. And we use a lot of the same techniques as other countries that have the same approach. So the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and a lot of European countries, their tools are different, but they all kind of have these same set of goals, which is to recover things that are overfished and prevent anything else from being overfished. But those systems are just not very robust to climate change. And it's still kind of an open question of, well, what do we do with them? So, for example, when you have this situation where the fish off of a certain port are changing, fishermen can't just overnight switch from being a crab fisherman to being a cod fisherman. The equipment is different, the knowledge is different. And many of these fishing communities go back generations of passing down knowledge and spending years sort of as a deckhand and coming up in the industry to be able to pursue this trade. So that's actually the sticking point, is less about policy and more trying to figure out how we kind of keep fishing alive as an industry, if that's something we want to do, when all the resources are moving, a lot of the knowledge doesn't make sense anymore. And then simultaneously, you have these challenges where, when stocks start to move across international boundaries, you have these kind of ugly fights where people on both sides often overharvest them, for different incentives. So it's a hard question to answer.
Good answer.
Yeah. And we have a question from Janet. I think she's a new questioner. What effect is increasing ocean acidification expected to make?
So ocean acidification, if it's not a familiar term to people, people call it climate change's evil twin. And the simple version is that as the oceans get warmer as a result of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they're also getting more acidic. So their pH is literally going down. That more than anything challenges organisms that have a shell, because literally they have to invest a lot more energy to prevent the shell from dissolving. So that's things like mussels, crabs, abalone again here in California. The species that we've seen really struggle with ocean acidification is Dungeness crab in Washington state, which has had really significant ocean acidification. And it's something that's very much in the conversation about farming a lot of these species. So a lot of future aquaculture projects are focused on not fish, but invertebrates like oysters. And you do have to think, well, what if I put in an oyster farm and it becomes too acidic for the oysters to build and maintain their shells? So that's something that very much intersects with these questions about fisheries. So should we fish them less? Is there anything we can do for a species like Dungeness crab? Do we just sort of have to hope that they adapt or move or respond in some other way? And then, of course, when you have some species doing worse as a result of these impacts, it can cascade through the whole ecosystem through all of the ways that we discussed over the course of the past hour.
Rand has a question. What is happening with squid biomass?
We don't know. We wish we did. Squid are challenging to study and measure. The big squid have really, really, we call it cryptic, but just hard to observe life histories. They live really deep. We rarely see them. We don't know how many there are. We don't know how to build a model of whether they're increasing or decreasing. And even the squid that have a short life cycle and live closer to shore, like market squid, short fin squid, they're still quite hard to model. We don't have nearly as clear a sense of what causes their populations to go up and down, what environmental conditions they like. So those are fisheries that have big question marks around their future. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And just a reminder to the audience, if you can, if you want to type your questions now, we'd also, there's an upvote feature. You can click on the little thumbs up and we'll ask upvoted questions more often. And feel free, we can move on from fishing if you like. Although you said that's your passion, right?
It's all my passion. Don't worry.
I do have a question from Van, and thanks, Van. This is a kind of question about human adaptation or human evolution, right? Like we're lucky we can lean on technology,
Right.
but at some point, food shortages or migrations, conflicts, border conflicts, right? This is a big question, but how are humans adapting?
To climate change in general. There's so much we could do. We're not doing all of it, but one of the most direct forms of vulnerability that humans have to climate change is through summertime extreme heat. So when we have heat waves around the world, people get very ill, especially people in places that don't have power all the time or have blackouts during extreme heat events. So creating sort of urban resilience to extreme heat, and that can come from anywhere from sort of more stable power supply to more solar panels and heat pumps and ways to cool people's buildings and homes that won't expose them to a heat wave. There are lots of sort of higher tech solutions to that. And obviously, the big picture solution is to mitigate climate change. But that's not the only. So, in terms of mitigating climate change, there's also lots of personal actions that people can take that will help on that front. I often talk to people about having less meat in their diets, which is one of the biggest things people can do for um, climate change. Although there's a very prominent scientist who says the best thing you can do about climate change is just to talk to people about it, because it's really not a common topic of conversation. It is in my house, but in most people's houses, you don't sit around and talk about climate change, but maybe we should. The climate around us is changing. People have their own thoughts and experiences and perspectives to share. And that can be really empowering and can lead people to get inspired to do all kinds of things. So, things we can do range from taking those sort of personal actions on climate change to what can humanity do in the big picture. I think a large part of it is building resilience for the most vulnerable populations. And that includes everything from, preventing heat wave related deaths to trying to create international bodies to deal with the next pandemic, which may be sort of climate change related. There are lots of ways we can do more for vulnerable people than we are now.
Yeah, thank you. But I think the question was sort of how are humans adapting, not trying to solve it, but right. I mean, are we migrating? Are we moving? Are we
I see. Thanks
changing
for that.
our diets? Are we?
We are. So humans are on the move. That's very much the case. One and that's happening in a number of places. So the most obvious way that we're on the move is to escape sea level rise. So a lot of coastal communities that have experienced repeated flooding are just being abandoned. It's called managed retreat. And this is very controversial, right? Some people say that this is a place with culture and history, they don't want to abandon it. There are extreme cases of Pacific Islands where the entire island may succumb to sea level rise and not be inhabitable, which would cause like entire countries to cease to exist as a result of climate change, and therefore every citizen of that country to become a climate refugee. It hasn't happened yet, and hopefully it won't, but it might. So sea level rise is the most common, and obviously, as we've seen recently, wildfire can also trigger really major migrations of people.
Yeah, thank you.
So Stephanie has an interesting question. Stephanie has been with us as long as I have, I think, in Sluts and Steins. So thank you for coming again. She says, thanks you very much for the talk. A question about studying the history of species on the move. You mentioned that we have a lot of data on cherry blossoms and butterflies, and I gather that this reflects human interest in such and maybe affection for these species for various reasons. Are there other species about which we have proportionally larger amounts of data that come to mind?
Another one of my favorite questions. So this field is called historical ecology, and it's the art and science of trying to extract ecological information from things that weren't intended for this purpose. Since we haven't had scientific monitoring really anywhere for more than about 100 years. There are tons of examples of this. Someone sent me, my friends know I like this, someone sent me an example of shifts in freshwater dolphins in China, which are mostly extinct but used to be really common, recorded in ancient poems. Um, in the Caribbean, people compare the current distribution and abundance of things like turtles and corals and large fish to what they find in old newspaper clippings of like this fish won the sport fishing competition of the year and it's a shark versus now it's like a fish this big.
Mm.
One of my other favorites is that that scientists have reconstructed the historical forests of parts of North America by going through the sediments in the bottom of a lake and identifying the pollen with a microscope. So some forms of pollen are distinct enough that and then you can date the sediment and actually reconstruct forests for thousands of years. So there are tons of creative ways to do this. Often it is reflected in human interest, but sometimes it's human uses. You can also there's an archaeological art of going through indigenous trash heaps, which are called middens, to understand what animals were present and pieces they were using. So this is a fascinating field that really blends kind of history, anthropology, and ecology.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll ask one of mine. I'm wondering, besides ocean creatures, I'm wondering about larger agriculture. Like, what are some of the big cash crops doing with climate change? I mean, a famous one, we may not be able to grow wine in California anymore, but what about corn and wheat and soybeans and these huge crops that we depend on?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'll speak to it to the degree I can. A lot of modern agriculture is the yield of modern agriculture is driven by the amount of water that we use for it and the amount of fertilizer that we use for it. So some of what happens with agriculture is due to stuff that's not climate change, but warming is threatening some specialty crops that just aren't going to do as well and might not be worth growing or might not taste as good like wine, but also are kind of really major food sources. So in particular, when you have extreme events, when you have heat waves, when you have fires, or when you have extreme events that threaten pollinators, which is the other kind of worst case scenario for agriculture, there have been, and I think maybe, probably will be in the future, big shocks to our food system. Our food system has, every major grain and product is grown in a number of places, but even when there are tiny disruptions to our food system, the effects can be huge, not only on like grocery prices, but also people going hungry in some places. We all remember the cargo ship that got stuck in that canal and then no one had groceries for 6 months afterwards. It's a extremely brittle system. And so there's the question of how climate change will affect crops, and the answer is yes, it is. But also on the social side, it's just not kind of worse than U.S. federal fisheries. There's no room for error in that food provisioning system, and so it is something that people are very worried about. And I'm gonna put up my last slide so people and I can talk through it at the end. But I think people are probably good staring at my outline. I'm happy to keep answering questions though.
Anthony asks, are species and interspecies dynamics assumed to be linear? And how much chaos is introduced because of non-linearities?
Well, dynamics is a big word. And increasingly, we fit models that don't assume anything is linear, although sometimes that's our sort of best guess for convenience. And often when we're studying nature, we don't have enough data to detect whether things are linear or nonlinear or chaotic. So even if we have a lot of data on from a natural place, we might have 15 years or 20 years. But if that ends up being 15 or 20 data points, you don't have as much information as you would like to be able to say, well, I'm really confident that this is a polynomial and not a line, or that there's actually chaos emerging in the system or something like that. So there are questions about the statistics we choose that are totally valid, but one of our biggest limitations is just the data that we have going into these studies. In my own research, I try to always kind of use models that allow things to be nonlinear if that's what best explains the data. And the presence of chaos in nature is really widely debated in a really interesting question because, of course, chaos is unpredictable, right? We all know about the butterfly effect. So, butterfly flaps its wings, it creates a little current of air that changes some weather pattern and it causes a storm on the other side of the world. And if that's what's happening in nature, no one's ever going to be able to predict nature. There is no point in ever trying to predict species in the move or anything else. And some people think chaos is actually really common in natural systems. We often say that ecology is not like rocket science. It's way more complicated. There are way more free variables in a forest than there are in a spaceship. And so if that actually is so complex that it leads to chaos, we may not be able to predict it ever. Great question.
Before I let Mike go on here, please upvote. We need some help here in picking out the best questions.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks, David. I have a wonderful question from Stephanie W. Stephanie is working on climate literacy education with our K through 12 students in Fremont Unified School District. What's your favorite environmental example or story or lesson you would love to see in curriculum? Thank you so much. Love learning how slugs are changing the world with knowledge.
Oh my goodness, that's an amazing question, and it's a lot of pressure. What's my favorite example? I do love talking to people about species on the move because actually there is some social research showing that the story of species being on the move is a really effective climate change communication tool because it's so easy to picture and it feels so personal, right? You know what's outside your front door, you know the tree on your block, you know the neighbor whose plants are flowering. And so once you realize those things might be changing around you, it's called a tangible anchor. So I think just generally communicating about species on the move is actually, I think, interesting in and of itself, but also actually a way to build consensus um, and engagement on climate change as a topic and as a whole.
That's a good point. I'm going to ask the question about slugs. So, in my day as a slug up on campus, again 50 years ago, on rainy days, you would have to really watch where you were going because there were a lot of them. Slimy critters. Are they moving? Anybody studied them up there?
Okay, I don't know. It's a great question. Anecdotally, I can tell you I saw a family in Berkeley this weekend. We have not had a lot of slugs this winter, and they said they have a ton of banana slugs in the Berkeley Hills. I don't know
Oh,
what that tells us about whether they've shifted, whether they used to be in the Berkeley Hills, but I agree. I have, in my time as a slug, I have not seen as many slugs as I expected or hoped.
Oh, I have one question, another question from Susan. This is interesting. In addition to species migrating and the fishermen moving, right? What about aquaculture, right? Like we can perhaps farm some of these fish, but then maybe the place you have to put these fish farms might be moving.
This is an excellent question. So aquaculture is when we farm fish or shellfish, could be anything. And a few years ago, it surpassed what's called wild capture fisheries, which is just what you think about when you think of fishing. It's someone actually catching something from the wild. Aquaculture is now bigger than all global fisheries in its production of tons of food. And unlike wild fisheries, which are at the same level, which is good, right? Because we don't want to overfish them. Aquaculture is growing. And so this is increasingly like the seafood of the future. And it is a big question. Well, where do we put it? Because the oceans are getting warmer. And the answer to that really depends on the species. So I mentioned for things, if you're farming oysters, you need to be really mindful of ocean acidification and try to put oyster farms places that we don't think are going to have significant ocean acidification in the future. The oceans aren't like a bucket where all of the effects are kind of the same throughout. So even though they're all getting warmer, and even though ocean acidification is happening, these things are very enormously from place to place. And so you can still find plenty of little pockets that will have a suitable climate, will have the right pH in the future. And there are really active ongoing efforts to do that for all forms of aquaculture. Trying to grow a species to sort of replenish a wild population is much more controversial. Uh, and actually, people don't really like growing the species next to the wild one at all because the wild populations are experiencing natural selection and are ideally kind of staying as adapted to their environment as possible. The ones in the farm are just getting fed all day. And if you go look at a salmon farm, the salmon, like, they don't look amazing. They're not prime salmon specimens because that's not really, they just are salmon eggs that got dumped into a tank and then raised. So people don't want those interbreeding with wild salmon because they think it will kind of diminish the capacity of wild salmon to survive in the future.
We have another agricultural question from Jan. What role does land animal agriculture? What's the dynamic between that and the health of the oceans? And
Mm.
is there any kind of a dynamic with changes in animal agriculture?
So that relationship between land-based animal agriculture and ocean health kind of it ranges from very direct to very indirect. So on the very direct side, land-based agriculture creates a lot of I won't say pollution, but changes the nutrient and sort of chemical content of the water that comes off of those places. So anywhere downstream of a farm where you have animals is going to have a huge amount of um, nitrogen and phosphorus and a bunch of other stuff that the animals either were eating or pooping. It might also have antibiotics and stuff like that. And if that's all going out to the ocean, that will have sort of immediate local consequences. So that is a huge strain on our estuaries and our bays to kind of absorb and filter that pollution. And if they don't, it can degrade both the species that live in those places and protect us, things like seagrass and oyster beds that take in pollution and clean out the water. And sometimes they also get kind of overwhelmed by that type of pollution. So that's one way that they very directly can affect ocean health. And the other indirect way is just that eating meat is not a super efficient way to get energy. And so it contributes very disproportionately to climate change relative to eating to a plant-based diet where um, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with each meal are just lesser. And so that also kind of indirectly benefits ocean health.
Okay, now we're just about out of time, and we haven't gotten to the elephant in the room. There's a few questions about what what smart people are doing to solve climate crisis itself. But there's an interesting comment from Susan. Maybe this gives us some insight into her previous questions. This is as an example. So she's pointing out, we're recording this talk. It's going to be up on YouTube, as we said. Your talk will go into a data center, and if it's stored for a long time, the energy and water needed for the servers in the data center will have a huge carbon impact. I'm working on creating sustainable data centers by putting them into an industrial ecology, but people don't recognize this problem. I think this is, I've never thought about this before. Do you have any, do you know about this problem?
I do know about this problem. I agree it's a big problem. And at the moment, I think what people are most worried about is the energy intensity of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is enormous compared to me uploading a video or me storing a data set on the cloud, all of which are things I do. And uh, you're correct. They have a material cost because they're going to end up being stored somewhere, and they have an energetic cost to maintain them. But the amount of energy and that we need for sort of modern computing, especially AI, is staggering, and it's not something that anyone really wants to have a conversation about. But it's a huge emerging issue, and so I think working on real solutions, which it sounds like is what you're doing, is an incredibly important thing to do. As scientists, a lot of colleagues who really use these incredibly computationally intensive tools do try to do so in kind of the most energy efficient way possible. So they're really careful about kind of what models they run and where and how they store things. But scientists are not driving the energy and materials cost of computing. It's definitely the private sector, and it's a huge emerging problem.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fritzdon. I would, if people could put in their comments, thanks to our slug professor down in the Q&A box, that would be appreciated. Also, please consider, as has up on her slide, making a gift to the Outstanding Ocean Science Student Award. Now, the link for that is down in the chat box, or you can see it up there on the screen. If I guess you can't click on that, but you can look it up online. I'd also like to extend our thanks to the staff of the Alumni Relations and Special Events offices. Further, we have a number of alumni volunteers. In fact, our team, Slugs and Stein's team, has expanded with some excellent people. It's become so strong that I am choosing to step aside after my 7+ years as an active team member and turn it over to the fine team that has come in. I must say it's been most enjoyable, a very exciting run, and this seminar was an example of the kind of inspiration we get from the many professors up there. Now, we hope to have another event in a month's time, be the second Monday of March, but please stay tuned for an announcement. We're not quite sure yet. Meanwhile, though, UCSC has other exciting events awaiting, and you can find most of these at calendar.ucsc.edu. So on the 5th of March at the Santa Clara campus, will be another CRAW lecture. These are science and technology based. This one will be on building smarter, safer systems, unlocking AI's potential for autonomous systems with proven performance. That'll be in Santa Clara. Now on Sunday, February 16th, and this is an OLLI event, olli.ucsc.edu. Professor Terry Williams will share her research on the biology of big cats, from local pumas to African lions. That'll be up on campus. Oh, excuse me, the Santa Cruz campus. So, on behalf of UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you so much for joining us, and please come back another second Monday.